welcome everybody to this second presentation of the second round of the Shelves, which is a series of CUP volumes presentation co-organized by Filosofia Antica Torino, Cambridge University Press, and Leuven. We have Giulia De Cesaris. So the volume we are presenting today, Cosmology and Biology in Ancient Philosophy from Thales to Avicenna, edited by Ricardo Salles, is devoted to the study of a topic that is receiving more and more attention in recent years. So the format of today will be the following. I will invite the editor to tell us something about the volume. Then Brooke Holmes kindly accepted to discuss the volume. And then we open the floor to debates, also with the contributors that are with us today. And then please feel free to join the discussion. Also, let me remind you that the CUP is kindly offering a 40% discount on any volume presented in this series. And to get the discount, you should just write an email to Michael Sharp, whose email address you should now find in the chat. And then we can start. So Ricardo Salles is a researcher at the Universidad Autónoma de Mexico, and his main areas of expertise are the Stoics and Hellenistic philosophy and Aristotle, especially on metaphysics, physics, and ethics. And his main publications are the Stoics on Determinism and Compatibilism, the Spanish translation and commentary of Alexander de Mixtione, and a collection with translation and commentary of the fragments of the early Stoics. So please, Ricardo, if you would like to introduce the volume.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. No, I want to start thanking our hosts, Federico Petrucci, Arianna Piazzalunga, and Giulia De Cesaris, and also the group Filosofia Antica a Torino, together with CUP for organizing this event. And very special thanks to Brooke Holmes, of course, who accepted to do the presentation. I look forward very much to her comments. And yes, of course, I'm also thankful to all the volume contributors who are present today, as well as to everybody for their interest in the event. Well, I think I will be very brief and limit myself to some quick remarks on the genealogy of the book and what I take to be the main objective of the collection. So the volume is the outcome of 3 conferences organized here in Mexico City from May 2016 to February 2017. Many of the contributors to the volume were present at these conferences. Thus, Barbara Sattler, Emanuele Vimercati, George Boy Stones, and Jim Hankinson were at the first conference on May 2016. Katia Vogt and Lloyd Gerson were at the second in August 2016 in August. And André Lax and John Cooper attended the third conference in February 2017. If I may, could I show some pictures to everybody? Pictures that I took at that point. May I? So
yes, I just made you co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. So, for example.
Okay. Yeah.
This is one of the. Can you see it? This is one of the pictures that we took when John Cooper and André Lax were participating. This was at the Institute. So here we are with some colleagues here from Mexico City. And also, well, I think, so this is one of the pictures. I have another one of us, Emanuele, Barbara, George, Jim, and I at Teotihuacan. I can show it to you later. So, so the topic that unified the 3 conferences was cosmic intelligence and cosmic soul. In fact, the title of in Spanish of the 3 conferences was El Cosmos Inteligente. Now, the aim of the conferences was primarily to explore the idea that the cosmos as a whole is a single living animate being, comparable in many fundamental respects to an animal and especially to an intelligent animal. So in one of the strongest versions of this idea, for example, the Stoic one, the different species of living beings constitute the organic parts of the cosmos in the sense that they have a specific function within the whole in much the same way as the different parts of an ordinary animal, its fins or its eyes, for instance, have a specific function in the life and the behavior of the animal as a whole. Now, it soon became clear to all of us that we had to enlarge the scope of the project. We also needed to include biological themes in cosmology so biological themes in cosmology and cosmological themes in biology that didn't necessarily refer to cosmic intelligence and soul, even though cosmic intelligence and soul had to remain one of its central topics. So I shall refer to some of these new themes in a few seconds. In any case, with this change in mind, I commissioned some additional chapters that were not part of the original lineup and would complement those that were presented at the conferences. This enlarged project was submitted to Michael Sharp at CUP in April 2018. Michael was interested in the idea right from the beginning, and after several revisions, we signed a contract later that year, and the final version was handed in mid-2019. Now, the pandemic that began in March 2020 affected many of us, but the production of the book at CUP followed its course almost normally, so that in early 2021, last year, the volume was out. The volume as a whole is extremely rich, and it would be difficult for me to convey in a few words its complexity and scope. In the editorial introduction, I tried to enumerate and briefly describe the main topics addressed by the contributors. I believe that this list is still helpful if we want to have an overall idea of the contents. So the topics may be divided as follows. First, this is one first group of questions or topics. Why would the cosmos have a soul of its own? What is the analogy, if any, between the psychic powers of the living beings and those of the cosmos? Second, biology and cosmology depend on one another by the use of biological concepts in cosmology and of cosmological concepts in biology. But is either of these two disciplines more basic than the other, or are they at exactly the same explanatory level? Third, what is the teleological relation between living things and the cosmos as a whole? In particular, do the former serve a higher cosmological purpose, or is the cosmos teleologically ordered for their sake? And what is the place of human beings within this complex teleological structure? Fourth, if the cosmos is an animate, intelligent being, what is the nature of its thoughts and actions? How do these relate to our own thoughts and actions? And do they pose a threat to our autonomy as subjects and agents? Fifth, and this would be the last set of questions, what is the place of zoogony in cosmogony? No account of the generation of the cosmos could be complete without an account of the origin of living species. But how exactly do these evolve from lower species? Or in the case of non-evolutionary theories, how does the design of a living species involve features of lower species? So in general, I really enjoyed very much editing this volume. Most of these themes are still under investigated in scholarship on ancient philosophy. And the 16 essays that compose this volume will, I hope, help to set the ground for a discussion of issues. So thanks a lot. And we can discuss some of these questions in what follows.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ricardo, for this presentation. So I will now leave the floor to Brooke Holmes. Brooke Holmes. Her main areas of specialization encompass ancient Greek medicine and life science, ancient philosophy, Greek literature, and reception studies. She is a professor of classics at Princeton University, and her main publications are The Symptom and the Subject, The Emergence of the Philosophical Body in Ancient Greece, and Gender, Antiquity, and Its Legacy. Please, Brooke, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's interesting, the book, The Symptom and the Subject, The Emergence of the Physical Body, but the philosophical body speaks, I think, to how the original topic of the conference, Cosmic Intelligence, has shaped the volume as a whole. That was enlightening. So thank you for the opportunity to do this. I want to just start today by recognizing that both my place of employment, Princeton University, and the building where I am now in downtown Manhattan, stand on lands which are part of the ancient homeland and unceded territory of the Lenape peoples. And I want to do this the start as one step towards paying respect to Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, to acknowledge their ongoing efforts to continue in and return to their homeland. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity this morning to respond to this volume of essays edited by Ricardo Salles, Cosmology and Biology and Ancient Philosophy from Thales to Avicenna, published last year by Cambridge. One reason that I was interested in taking on this opportunity was that the entwinement of cosmology and biology is one that's been occupying me for some time. In the book, I'm finishing on the concept of sympatheia in the ancient Mediterranean. So what could be more appealing than a new book of essays on by leading scholars in ancient philosophy on the domain of the cosmobiological. At the same time, as I was saying at the start, the genre of the edited volume poses particular challenges, I think, to a response of this kind. And this is especially true of a volume that approaches its subject matter with a capacious framework. As Ricardo writes in the introduction, the thesis that defines cosmobiology, here glossed as biology and cosmology intersect one another, is, quote, very broad. Accordingly, the volume's chapters encompass ancient cosmobiology in all its generality. And in fact, I was going to go through the topic, so I'm glad, Ricardo, that you did so now, so that everyone has a sense of what that capaciousness is. We might extend this generality or capaciousness to the very definition of the two central terms, cosmology and biology, and especially to the latter, biology. After all, cosmology is relatively easy to track across the chapters through the ancient author's preoccupation, at least from Plato onward, with something called cosmos. But biology requires a bit more elaboration. The target term here is not really bios, of course. As Sattler points out in her chapter, biology is first mentioned as a science of living beings in the 18th century and gets codified around 1800. But setting aside the complex of reasons for dividing zoology from biology in modernity, what the language of biology is generally tracking in the volume is life. But where then do we find life located in the ancient texts, if not in bios? In most cases, the relevant entity is going to be something like psyche, as Salles points out in the introduction. Also important is the claim made by Timaeus in the eponymous Platonic dialogue that the cosmos is a living thing, et zoon. And then there's the distinction that becomes especially important in the Hellenistic period, not only in philosophers like the Stoics, but also in medical theorists, as Heinrich von Staten has shown, between psyche as a principle of animal life and physis as a principle of something like nutritive life, a distinction that has relevance in, for example, Gerson's analysis of Plotinus in the penultimate chapter of the volume, or in the work that Boyce Stones eventually puts the Stoics Grammaticoi Logoi to in his second contribution to the volume on the thought or thinking of Stoic God. So this cluster of life concepts speaks to the potential scope of the domain captured by an inquiry into ancient cosmobiology, that is, again, to its level of generality. But to the extent that these terms have significance in dynamic relation to one another, it also starts to point to the outlines of a more delineated historical inquiry behind the term ancient cosmobiology. And indeed, in the introduction to the volume, it's this more circumscribed historical project that actually defines generality in terms of what lies beyond that project's narrower articulation. And by that narrower articulation, I'm speaking of the concept of the cosmic or the world soul. But this is a concept more firmly and perhaps problematically embedded in cosmobiology as a domain marked by ancient philosophy as history, and more specifically, cosmology as a reception tradition shaped by the Timaeus. And in practice, we might say the force of this historically situated cosmobiology at times shapes even what we might take to be outside of it. So it is true, as Salles points out, as a reason why we need a more expanded cosmobiology, that Aristotle notably accepts the thesis that biology and cosmology intersect while rejecting the concept of the world soul. And it's also true that Aristotle makes these moves within a set of terms that have been set already by the Timaeus. So my point here is not that there is no crossing of cosmology and biology outside the specific question of an ensouled cosmos in ancient philosophy, nor is my point that the more capacious framework of cosmology and biology isn't actually the right one for the genre of the edited volume, predicated as it is on a range of voices and research programs. Indeed, it's perhaps precisely this genre that can do justice to the complexity, even the messiness of a philosophical tradition, rather than reducing it to the expression of a collective like the Greeks, or to a neat Hegelian dialectic, someone like Canguilhem's approach. Rather, what I'm trying to bring out is that one of the challenges in responding to the volume is that on this capaciously defined field, I can't help but feel a more specific historiographical question working its way through it, sometimes more visibly and sometimes not. This question, I'll add, extends beyond the adventures of the world soul to the articulation of life itself as an object of philosophical and especially cosmological interest. So that question, as I said, doesn't determine the scope of the volume. And so I had laid out the general philosophical themes. And I wanted to really emphasize that Salles goes on in the introduction to point out that many of these themes in their generality deserve further attention from scholars. And it's undoubtedly an achievement of this volume to map anew ways into and around this range of compelling questions in cosmobiology. The chapters indeed range widely. They engage closely with key texts and subject crucial passages to closer and often new interpretation. I learned much, and I expect to go back to the text many times as resources for a host of philosophical and interpretive questions. And needless to say, this is such a rich volume that I'm still in the early stages of metabolizing it. And I would emphasize we're in the last week of the term. And so my digestion will require some more leisure. But because this is a broad space of philosophical inquiry, I wanted to use my comments in the rest of this response to tarry with the question that I have already raised about the historiographical questions governing cosmos and life, precisely because I think it doesn't operate at the level of the volume itself as a whole, even as it shapes individual chapters. And because I don't have time to go into great detail about individual chapters, this will be one principle of selection. So of particular interest to me here is the more specific question of what it means to read the Timaeus itself as the urtext of a cosmobiological tradition in Greek philosophy in the spirit of biology, that is life as we conventionally understand it. Its status as urtext is reaffirmed in the volume by the contribution of André Lacks, which is an abbreviated version of his important 2018 Oxford Studies article, which is here entitled Souls and Cosmos Before Plato, 5 Short Doxographical Studies. So Locke's central argument is in essence that the concept of the world soul is Platonic. More specifically, he says, any analysis of the doxographical evidence for pre-Platonic notions of an ensouled world has to take into account how these reports have been shaped by Platonizing and Stoicizing frames of interpretation that turn on, or we might say take advantage of, the shifting and multiform meaning of psyche itself as both breath and life. In short, Locke says he is interested in, quote, process by which pre-Socratic worlds became ensouled. By contrast, that Plato does ensoul his cosmos seems a relatively straightforward proposition. The Timaeus describes the demiurge's creation of a world soul that with the world body makes the cosmic animal. That said, what the life of the cosmos is for Plato is a bit more complicated. Different chapters approach the question as both readers of the Timaeus itself and as readers of Plato's ancient readers. One question that isn't explicitly raised in other chapters, however, or in the volume as a whole, is to the extent to which Lax's reception-based reading of the pre-Socratic material extends to the trajectory of the rest of the volume. That is to say, how much the life or the biology that we read, or ancient readers read back into the Timaeus, was itself shaped by those who follow. Aristotle, Theophrastus, who doesn't appear in this volume, but who at least compares the cosmos to an animal in his metaphysics, and the Stoics, to say nothing of medical writers in these centuries, including, of course, Galen. So the point that I want to make here isn't that there's a gap only, maybe we might say, between our modern concept of biology and the life at stake in Plato's dialogue, as Sattler suggests at the end of her chapter. Rather, it's to pay attention to how the terminology of biology can actually mask potentially significant shifts, not just in what life is in the period in question in the volume, but also in what kind of work it might do for cosmology. After all, cosmobiology is one option among others. That doesn't mean that the Greeks are the only cosmobiologists, and Egyptian cosmology may pose an interesting comparative model as well as a syncretic model in the early centuries CE, if we think about Hermeticism. But it does mean that one might make sense of the order of the cosmos differently, as it would seem to be, and I'm not an expert, but it would seem to be in Babylonian models where the primary model is divine writing. And even if we think of other models, we could look closer to home, to mathematics as a challenge of different kinds to what we designate as cosmobiology. My own answer, to put it really briefly, would be that it's precisely in the space between Plato and the Stoics that the enmattered living thing becomes a paradigmatic model of complex unity. That is, a one that's not a mereological atom. At the same time, the more there's thinking about living things as unities, it opens up questions about how their pursuit of life is only possible within particular environments that seem ordered to this end, what we might say cosmology in the form of ecology. Now, these related questions, I can't help but saying, I think help explain the rise of cosmological sympathy, which is a term that's almost entirely absent from the volume. It shows up in a couple citations where it's not discussed further, except in Gerson's chapter. And it was interesting to me that sympathy doesn't even show up or is mentioned in the context of Vogt's claim in her chapter that, quote, all entities in the world are connected with each other in what we might call a physically or biologically real way, even though sympathy at that moment might be said to be central to understanding Stoic cosmobiology. But I want to raise these points only to suggest actually that Lax's reception-based reading of the pre-Platonic evidence has, I think, wider implications. Maybe it's not fair to say for the volume as a whole, but just for the way that we approach these questions as a community of thinkers. So let me try to make my point a little bit clearer by moving on to Sattler's chapter, The Ensouled Cosmos in Plato's Timaeus. So Sattler foregrounds biological science as a frame for reading Plato's dialogue. But at the outset of the chapter, she also points out two major ways in which the language of biology might be misleading. First, because the world is self-sufficient, quote, a lot of our common biological notions are of no relevance for an account of the cosmos as a living being. The challenge of conceptualizing a living being without a world to live in is a familiar one from the Timaeus, problematic for the Stoics too. And indeed, it arguably only gets harder after Plato, who pays only limited attention to plants and animals. With Aristotle, we get into a much richer analysis of the ways in which living beings, and especially animals, are seemingly organized not only as wholes that comprise symbiotic parts, but as beings whose forms of life are oriented toward particular habitats. And the mesh between the nature of an animal and the larger world it inhabits becomes even more important in the Stoics. This point brings us back to the second way in which our concept or idea of biology might mislead in the Timaeus, according to Sattler. Although Plato does give an account of all kinds of living beings, he's ultimately focused on rational living beings. And the result is that, Sattler says, we end up with rational psychology and rational theology. And by the end of the chapter, this encompassing notion of life that we start with actually seems to split on her reading into, quote, two independent notions, one tied to reason and intellect, and so addressed to the model, the form and the cosmos as a whole, the other referring to any form of desire and so capable of extending to plants. Now, this split wouldn't necessarily mean that there's not work for both kinds of life to do in the Timaeus. In the appendix to his first chapter in the volume, Begotten and Made, on creation as cosmogony and Middle Platonism, Boyce-Stones, in fact, argues that it's insufficient to argue, as Sattler does, that the world soul is only rational. He makes a case for attributing to it a nutritive function as well that performs the maintenance of the cosmos as an animal. But going this route involves a number of interpretive moves, such as reading the lesser gods as powers in the world soul. That the Middle Platonists did indeed make those moves supports Boyce-Stone's argument in the chapter that they, that is the Middle Platonists, didn't privilege exclusively a demiurgic reading of cosmogony at the expense of a biological one that attends to the needs of the world as a living thing and not just a made object. But that argument doesn't necessarily disprove Sattler's point that Plato is overwhelmingly interested in life as the purely rational activity of the world soul in its operation in the heavens. It is, as we can see in Plato's remarks in the dialogue on astronomy, soul understood in these terms as a dynamic mathematical structure that has the capacity to organize our souls and their circuits after the trauma of being born into a physical body. We don't get a lot more, however, about how the world soul sustains the life of the world after cosmogony. So if later authors cared more about that question, it points to the ways in which Plato's cosmic animal could be reread through the prism of changing ideas of life, about the life of the cosmos and the lives within it. And in this way, I would say theology as biology in Plato looks quite different than theology as biology in Vogt's reading of the Stoics in her chapter, where she equates those. The question of the structure of the world also figures large in Elmore's chapter on Plato's Cosmology. As he points out, there's something of a scala vincularum in the Timaeus, which privileges the mathematical ratio as the highest form of bond that there is alongside the reasoning of the demiurge in the creation of the world, which he calls after David Sedley in intellectualizing physics. It's the proportion, the analogia, which generates the best form of complex unity. It's a lesser bond that the demigods use to make mortal creatures, one associated, he points out, with weaving and the capacity to be worn down and unwoven in the process of time. And these observations work well together with Verity Hart's arguments in her 2002 book, Plato on Parts and Wholes, that although in the Timaeus, Plato's mereology moves into the physical world, the models of complex unity are geometric, not biological. So taken together, these papers point first to a form of life in the Timaeus as cosmobiology that looks very unbiological in its privileging of pure thinking, and second, to a form of complex unity that is mathematical rather than what we might call organic. And by organic here, I would say we're thinking of Aristotle's commitment to living things as paradigmatic complex unities and the function of soul to make a whole out of parts. And that kind of organic unity doesn't seem all that important in the Timaeus. Even if the beings in the world are its parts and wholes as they pertain to the animal in the Timaeus are important first and foremost in distinguishing between a species and a genus, which contains species as its parts, but is itself a whole. So we might say that it's the living thing in Aristotle and also medical and biological writers in the 4th and 3rd centuries is elaborated as a complex whole. Its implications for cosmology shift insofar as more pressure is placed on a principle that produces this dynamic organic unity, soul or nature. Cosmobiology at this point goes all the way down, we might say, asking how exactly the cosmos functions as an animal on the one hand, and how its dynamic order sustains the lives in it, predominantly through the capacity of the celestial bodies, especially the sun and the moon, to generate life cycles on Earth as an expression of cosmic capital N nature as providence. Now, certainly a number of the papers in this volume offer lots to think about from this angle. So that's to say, none of what I've been saying here should imply that they assume the Timaeus is the final word on the subject, far from it. So Dillon's chapter, for example, argues that the Epinomis extends the increasingly important work that the world soul did in Plato's late stage cosmology as a first principle. And what's especially interesting about this dialogue, he points out, is that the world soul is now noticed especially for its capacity not only to generate mathematical order, but also to generate the seasons and with them food that sustains life in the cosmos. Salles' chapter, to take another example, convincingly argues that Stoic arguments for the intelligence of the cosmos innovate vis-a-vis the Timaeus in their use of cosmocentrism. The Stoics, that is, argue that all beings in the cosmos exist for its sake, and it is because the cosmos is the beneficiary of everything else that nothing is better than it, as nothing is better than having intelligence and reason. The cosmos has these things. As he points out, Plato also thinks that everything exists for the sake of the cosmos in the laws, but rather than inferring from this that the cosmos is intelligent, Plato starts with the claim of cosmic intelligence and infers from this that natural beings exist for its sake. So grasping some of the difference between these two positions, the Stoic and the Platonic one, I think can be helped maybe by thinking about the teleological unity of the Stoic world animal as contributing to its exemplary life. And the chapter by Emanuele Vimercati explores how cardiocentrism is in fact realized in the structure of the cosmic animal in post-Chrysipian Stoics, although I would love to talk more about the importance of the hematic model at the cosmic level, but I won't get into that. That was interesting. And particularly in how it generates a better form of immanent soul than pneuma. I'm not convinced on that point, but I would love to hear more. Boystone's chapter on the thought of Stoic God takes seriously what it would mean for God to think in exactly the same way or qualitatively the same way as animals do. And a line of argument that, as I've already suggested, makes more space for something like an immanent vegetal nature alongside a cosmic ruling faculty. So all of this is to say, and I'm just giving a taste of the real range of the volume, that the volume attests multiply to the increasingly complex ideas of cosmic life and thinkers after Plato. So my point is a simpler one, which is only that the language of biology is unifying, perhaps imbues life itself in the tradition with too much givenness and risks obscuring rather than drawing out the way in which cosmobiology after Plato too is very much entangled in questions of reception along the lines that Lax suggests. This point bears too on how we think the question of nature, and especially the nature of the world that could function as capital N nature, intersects with cosmobiology as a tradition. A question that takes us back to what I said at the outset for what's at stake in seeing the Greek cosmological tradition. A tradition, of course, often framed as physiologia. What's at stake in seeing physiologia as cosmobiological, which it continues to be, as Alpina's chapter on Avicenna shows. But I want to stop here and reiterate my gratitude to the contributors and especially to the editor for this incredibly rich volume, which will indeed enable more work to be done on these fascinating topics. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Brooke, for these stimulating comments, which I think raised a lot of interesting points. So I shall now open the floor to the debate. First, does the editor or any of the contributors would like to say something or to reply something? Otherwise, we can open the floor to the discussion, and you can just raise your hands by using the function at the bottom of the page.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
But maybe I should leave it for the end and let other people ask their questions. What do you think?
I think we can discuss it now. I mean, as you prefer, but.
Yes, well, thanks a lot to Brooks for her very detailed comments on the volume. And well, I wanted to mention quickly one of the issues that she raised, which was the absence of sympathy, of the concept of sympathy and in the volume. And that's true. I entirely agree that this is something that is missing from the volume, and it would have been desirable to include something about it and to emphasize that it is a key concept in Stoic cosmobiology, because sympathy in Stoicism is what explains how different parts of the cosmos are connected to one another, even if they are very distant from one another. No? And so how the moon can have effects on Earth and things like that. No? I mean, how different parts of the cosmos are connected causally to one another. So given that sympathy is important to explain the unity of the cosmos, and given that, I mean, if we want to look at the cosmos as a living thing, we have to see it as a unified system. Then, of course, sympathy is essential to cosmobiology, and that's perfectly true. It would have been good to include something about sympathy and I mean to deal with this concept more in detail. But and this is a question I have for Brooke. Do you think that sympathy, so understood, also plays a role in non-Stoic cosmobiologies? For example, do you know of any author who may be influenced by the Stoics, but who is not himself or herself a Stoic? Do you know of anyone who gives a central role to sympathy outside the Stoics, Brooke? So that's one. I mean, it would be very valuable to trace the development of this concept in ancient cosmology outside the boundaries, no, of Stoicism. So that's why I wanted to ask you this. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer relatively quickly, but I mean, you know, Plotinus is the most maybe obvious case, and Gerson talks about that. I have a passage. I'm not going to put it up because I know we're short on time, but you can see very clearly how Plotinus's reading of, you know, 30A following reads cosmic animal as entailing sympathy in quite deliberate and detailed ways. But even someone like Alexander of Aphrodisias, when he's, you know, critiquing the Chrysippus theory of mixture, will recognize sympatheia as a feature of the cosmos and cosmic order that requires an explanation that is not an immanent material principle of soul. So he posits there, you know, a potential koinonia of matter. He starts to look for providential reasons. So I think one of, you know, even someone like Cicero, who's our main source for cosmological sympathy, does something interesting. He repeatedly recognizes it as a feature of the cosmos, but resists the explanation being given by the Stoics in the De Natura Deorum, as well as, you know, De Divinatione. So I think what you start to see in the reception of Stoic cosmobiology, or their sympathy in particular, is this starts to be the way we understand the organization of parts in relationship to a whole. There's a case, anyways, I could go on. There's a case in Sextus Empiricus where he seems to think that cosmological sympathy in an astrological sense entails the position that the cosmos is an animal, because that's how you would get the kind of part-whole relationship that sympathy represents. So I think it's a pretty dense field in the early century CE.
It is indeed.
And maybe I'll just throw out really quickly, knowing there's other questions. I mean, you know, I was struck that Vogt didn't mention it. And I do think that there's a kind of after effect of Reinhardt. And, you know, sympathy continues, you know, when it appears even, I can't remember now, it must be in Manueli's chapter with a reference to Manilius, and it's in quotes, right? Because it's a concept I think we're still worried about when we think about kind of cosmic mysticism or cosmic life. Of course, the volume talks about panpsychism, so it's not as it we're afraid to go there, but I think Reinhardt's shadow extends over some of this work.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
A lot for all this. Yeah, you're absolutely right. These are very relevant authors for the study of this concept. Thanks.
Okay, now we have a question by Barbara Sattler, please.
Yeah, this is actually another question. This is a thank you to Brooke Holmes for your wonderful kind of introduction to the volume. And I just was very happy that you also brought up this whole question of, it's not quite clear what we actually understand by biology. It's a notion that's very much shaped by what we today understand by biology. But when I was working on my chapter, for instance, I was surprised that notions like an organ Plato explicitly kind of excludes that for the cosmos as a whole, because that would indicate there's some lack, some need, and something like this, where an organ would come in or some interaction with an outside. There's no outside. And that we actually have to look at many notions in the surrounding. And I think one of the biggest surprises for me was when I worked on this chapter, was when I talked to my biology colleagues at St. Andrews at that time. And I asked them, so what's your standard definition? And they all told me, well, you know, we have a list of stuff that's normally included, but there's no agreement on what we understand by biology. There's no standard definition. And I found this very interesting that, you know, this is a time in the ancient times when we are grappling with the notion of life in its various forms, not only bios and so on, but different expressions, but it's not as if this is a concept that's, so to say, fully clarified right now. And so in some sense, I think this just shows that this is a conversation that's still continuing, how to grasp what life is.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, I think that the thing that really crystallized for me in thinking about that contrast you draw was to ask, well, how much of what we think biology is actually unfolding in the kind of post-Aristotelian relationship to thinking about nature and nutritive soul, so that the gap may not be ancient modern, but may actually be unfolding in the ancient material itself.
Right.
Okay. Anna Marmodoro, please.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to pick up on a point that Brooke actually raised. So thank you for that, Brooke. But the answer might involve Barbara. So it's about the distinction that you nicely characterized as between geometrical mereology and kind of organic mereology. And you made the point that it may seem surprising that in the timaeus, when mereology comes into the world, the living world, it's a geometrical mereology rather than otherwise. And I was wondering whether the surprise there is somehow due to the fact that geometrical mereology does not involve functionally differentiated parts, or you find it surprising because it's a type of mereology that doesn't allow for emergence, or, you know, I just wonder whether there could be any more comments to be made on that. Sorry, I didn't specify to whom the question goes, but any of you who want to say something about it would be great.
I mean, I think it's like it was in a way, I think my surprise. So Barbara, you can certainly respond too, but I was thinking of Verity Hart's book and looking for, you know, the living being as a model of complex unity, and instead finding the geometrical model where the analogia is the immanent bond that creates the sense of unity rather than soul or nature, and the ways in which that makes it difficult to imagine a kind of dynamic unity, I think, in the same way that you would see in kind of guaranteeing continuity over life cycle that is so important in Aristotle's conceptualization of the living being as a model of complex unity. What's interesting to me, I mean, so that's one way of thinking about it. There's also questions, I think, that are opened up between the demiurgic model as opposed to, you know, the kind of what we think of biological reproduction, which comes out in George's first chapter. And there are these kinds, there's a kind of intuitive sense that one could kind of build something, you know, by putting things together in a particular way, as opposed to making something which has a capacity to remake and continue its life and maintain that unity, both through function, but also through kind of immanent presence of soul as holding it together or imposing unity. So I guess the one thing I would say on this point that I find that I didn't have time to put in there is, you know, Plato does have this model of what I would call organic unity. And it shows up in book 5 of the Republic, where he talks about what the sign of manufactured kinship in the Republic would look like when he says all of the people, you know, the finger feels the pain of the whole body, right? And that all of us, you know, all of the guardians would feel the pain and pleasure of the different parts. And that model, which is not, that's not a sympatheia model, but that will of course be the model that the Stoics use as the definition of a unified body, that the part of the finger, the pain of the finger is felt by the whole. So that's the kind of distinction that I'm interested in there between the kind of biological and the geometrical, but, you know, I'm sure you could help me get more precise about what the differences are.
I just have a very quick follow-up. Thank you, Brooke. I was just thinking differently. So, you know, what you just said clarified to me, your framework. So I was thinking of, for example, the dilemma of composition in De Theetitus, which is also something that Verity Hart's book discussed at length. I was thinking that as Verity sees it, Plato is quite Lewisian in relation to compositions, composition of elements into sums. So in that sense, I was less, I just thought, okay, the geometrical composition that we find in the Timaeus is actually in line with the general thinking of Plato as a Lewisian thinking, according to which the sum of the parts is just the sum of the parts. So, I mean, it was stimulating to hear, that you put more emphasis on other parts of Plato's works, where, the perhaps organic, holistic unity seems to be more emergent. Although it seems to me a bit of an Aristotelian look on Plato rather than Plato himself. It would be nice to talk more, but I should just.
Yeah. I mean, and in the Theaetetus, it's really language. So, it's language to geometry. But I think just to make myself clear, I mean, that's a part of it is that is an Aristotelian look at unity. And I think part of the story here is that what does it mean for a living being to be the paradigmatic? Unity shifts what is the work cosmobiology is going to do to think of the cosmos as one and many.
I'm sorry, just a quick thought that I had. I mean, it seems to me it depends a bit on the exact role of the part to the whole, and it seems to me that, I mean, the geometric unity that we have in the Timaeus ultimately what unifies all of that is the proportions that we have with the world soul, that we have with the in the triangles and so on. And there it seems to me that each of the elements has the same status or right or whatnot. We have A to B equals B to C and equals C to D, right? This kind of stuff that we get there. And the kind of an organic unity is one, I take it usually where the whole has some form of some special status vis-a-vis the parts, so that the parts are essential for it and contribute to it, but it is not just on the same level as the parts. And I mean, we in some funny sense, of course, we know that from Plato, from what Brooke's already kind of referred to, from political philosophy, right? And we know the way that the state works, that has a special status vis-a-vis its parts. But it's interesting that in the Timaeus, I think you're completely right, Anna. In the Timaeus, where we may expect it also for the organisms, it is perhaps not as prominent as we find it in the political philosophy.
Thank you very much, both.
May I just add a follow-up to this? I mean, this is a very fascinating issue in the Timaeus, and in fact, I mean, this might be just my wrong reading, but we have several levels of unification in the Timaeus, right? You have the soul, the unification ensured by the soul in isolation with respect to the body. Then you have the unification of the body through analogia and so on. And then you even have the third unification consisting in the introduction of time. So you have the whole word moving and being a living being, and then it's at 37C or something, the demiurge says, well, the product is fine, and now I want to make it even more similar to the model, and this is the reason why it introduces time. And at that point, a further unification is introduced, and maybe at that point you have a sort of, I mean, the proper cosmobiological unification involving, and this is indeed peculiar of Plato, both the purely psychical unification and the geometrical unification. And I wonder whether, I mean, if we didn't have time, we wouldn't have had a full unification of the word. So both the psychological and the geometrical unification wouldn't be really effective.
Well, I guess it depends on how we understand the relationship of, between unification and, so to say, orderliness. Because through time, it's certainly the world is made more orderly, thus more like the model. The organon of time is interesting that he uses the word here, they follow the circles of the world soul, and the world soul circles are put together according to these proportions. That's why I also talked about proportional unity, because I think that comes up in the body as well as the soul, and on the micro as well as the macro level. And so to say, the geometrical may be sometimes seen just as belonging to the body, but with the soul, we definitely also have this kind of proportion structure. So the question would then be whether we see, whether the unity would already be there for time, given that it follows, so to say, that the setup of the world soul, and whether the time just brings in more order, or whether more order is necessarily also more unity. I guess here we would enter into a discussion about what exactly we understand by unity, which is of course an important discussion to have.
I mean, I know David has a question, but I think this is such an interesting question to go back to the geometrical and the biological, because there's the orderly time, which is understood mathematically. And then there's the time of like the stoic life of the cosmos, which looks more like the dynamic unity of an organic life. So that seems time has different senses of producing relations that can create a sense of structure.
Right, and we have the term ion used for the model, which is normally related, a temporal term related to life before Plato, definitely, and very strongly so. And then, yeah, the question is, does it, because it means something that is traditionally translated as eternity, is life kind of going away from that term or not? So
Oh, okay, so if there aren't any other follow-ups on this, please, David Ibri.
Thanks. So I feel like my question isn't as clear in my own mind as I would like it to be, but it's inspired by Brooke's comments, and what I'm wondering about. I've been thinking about what is life for Plato. How do we understand how Plato is thinking about life? And Aristotle seems to have a view of life where life is said in many ways, and there's very different forms of life depending on the type of creature that you are. In the Timaeus, it seems like between reincarnation and the human's immortal souls being created out of the very same material as the world soul, it looks like you have a fairly even life across the world soul and the various organisms that are possible things that you can reincarnate into. It looks certainly more even, and I take it Aristotle complains about this. Oh, sorry. I take it that Aristotle complains about this in the first book of the De Anima. And so what I was thinking about and wondering about was, is it a general feature of these authors in the volume who are thinking about the world soul and its relation to biology to have a relatively unified notion of life, in contrast to the sort of notion that we get in Aristotle, where life is said in a variety of fairly contrasting ways? I mean, the more different the notion of life is, as it were, it seems sort of the less useful it is to think, well, the cosmos is alive and my dog is alive and I am alive. I mean, if life is radically different in those three different cases, it seems less useful than if it's the very same activity, living life, which is happening in the dog, me, and the cosmos. That makes for a very strong and interesting claim to help you understand both the dog and the cosmos, which is sort of less true if life is said in radically different ways. And so this is a little bit thinking post Plato and Aristotle. Do we continue to have a very unified notion of life among the authors who are thinking about this, or not? So anyway, that's the sort of cluster of issues that I've been thinking about, and I'm curious, anybody who wants to to jump in here if anyone has any thoughts, and I should now be muted.
I mean, I'm happy to say just one thing to David, that I think there is a real problem in Plato that, you know, once plants come in, they also are, but it's a very different account. And I think it's because Plato is not so concerned about them there. But I don't think that, I mean, in order to get a really unified account in Plato, I think you have to do some quite a lot of extra work to put the plants in, because he's more interested in having the cosmos and the model in than in the plants.
May I say something about this? Well, I'm not sure whether in Aristotle the concept of life is not fully unified in a strong sense. Well, what I want to say is that my first impression, at least, is that in Aristotle we do have a unified concept of life, rather than the idea that life is said in different ways, no? Is a proshenlegomenon, no? To use an Aristotelian term. So I think that in Aristotle, life is whatever is achieved by the sum of a number of capacities that range from the nutritive capacities, such as growth, no? Well, growth is one of them, and all the capacities involved in nutrition, no? And at a higher level, I mean, these activities that define life involve the activities of capacities such as the capacity of desire and perception. And at the highest level, these activities involves also the use of the capacity for thought. No, so life is just an activity that results from the use of these capacities. And I think that this strong and unified concept of life is what we find in later authors, no? So I think that the concept of life that runs through the volume is this basic concept of life. You know? I mean, this Aristotelian concept of life that goes back to Plato, of course. Plato too defines life in terms of soul, no? And soul in terms of these capacities. But it's perhaps Aristotle, no? In book 2 of the De Anima, who first defines, you know, life, well, what we call life, you know, in a very strong and unified way, as whatever is associated with soul. You know? So, but I'm not sure about this. Maybe you have a different view about this.
I guess I think of Chris Frey as somebody who makes a big deal. So there's a question of whether you put more emphasis on De Anima 2.1 or 2.2 and 2.3. And we get this geometric progression passage where when he says life is said in many ways in the De Anima, and the life of reason is different from the life of perception, which is different from the life of nutrition. And then it's as a triangle stands to a square, stands to a pentagon, and how you understand that is, okay, there's absolutely scholarly debate about how unified of a notion of life you get. So I was sort of taking it, I suppose, for granted that perhaps wrongly, that Aristotle's view isn't as unified. Just to briefly respond to Barbara, I completely agree that plants are an interesting and important exception, and I kind of agree that Plato doesn't seem as interested in them. But maybe what's important is the cosmos is engaging in the same activity as a huge number of living things. Like there's a fundamental unity between all of the animals and what's going on in the cosmos, even if the plants are a sort of exception, as opposed to, say, the cosmos having its very own form of life, which is radically different from what we are doing or what others. There needs to be some important identity, is what I was thinking. But I see that there's another hand here.
So maybe Brooke would like to say something more.
Sorry, I didn't raise my hand because I wasn't sure we had time, but I mean, maybe I would just add, I think that was helpful, David. And I think that persistent tension between particularly nutritive life and sensitive life is something that continues on in interesting ways that you can see. I mean, but even in the Stoics, and I'm thinking of Tony Long's, essay on soul and body in the Stoics, and the idea of a kind of soul that can create unity through being immanent everywhere and holding cohesive, and then, a kind of self-perception, that I'm thinking about the role of the soul's capacity to perceive itself. Does that extend to its non-conscious, organismic activities? I mean, that seems to me a real problem for the Stoics, even though they're trying to unify the soul. I mean, it becomes a real problem for Galen. And I think, Jim brings out that passage from Formation of the Fetus, where one of the problems Galen has is that if our rational souls were the same as our nutritive souls, why is it that I don't, sort of intuitively understand how my body works, the vegetal soul works. And so, we could get into that further, but like, seems to me a really persistent problem in the conceptualization of life that I'm working out in Plotinus, because Plotinus seems to put nutritive soul and sensible soul together as the organism and then take thinking out altogether. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents.
So perhaps we have time for a last very brief question by Karel Tain.
Yes, this is just a question of curiosity and very brief to what Ricardo said about Aristotle and the unified concept of life, because we are speaking about cosmology and biology. But do you think that you can square what you said with what Aristotle says in the cosmological context, for instance, about the animation of the first body? So on the celestial life, which doesn't seem to have anything in common with what, for instance, the Anima 2 is dealing with. And still there is it's empsychon. It's clearly, Aristotle is very emphatic that even for the axiological reason, it has to be alive because it's much better than if it were not, and so on and so forth. So could you put this together somehow?
Well, yes, of course, you're right. No, you are right, and I agree with David, when he says that in a sense life is said in many ways for Aristotle. My point was just that Aristotle's interest in the anima is to to explain, the activities of living beings ranging from plants to human beings in terms of a single concept of soul. And he says, well, all their activities of these very different animals have in common the fact that they are related to soul. They are caused by soul, and which is an idea that goes back to the Phaedo, for example. In the Phaedo, and David will correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Phaedo, Plato says that everything that we call life, and what explains that something is living, is its soul. So then, in Aristotle, we have this thesis that what unifies the activities of all these different creatures is the fact that they have a soul. And the concept of soul in Aristotle, well, as far as I can understand it, this concept of soul is not an ambiguous concept or a pros-hen legomenon. No, I mean, soul. The definition that he gives of soul is something univocal, no, and so that was my intuition, no. I mean, given that soul explains life, and soul is a unified concept, logically unified concept, as opposed to a pros-hen legomenon or an ambiguous term, then the concept of life in Aristotle is itself unified. No, but I agree with you that the way in which Aristotle defines soul and the kind of activities that he's interested in when he uses soul to explain them, this suggests that the cosmos couldn't have a soul, of course, because we don't see that the cosmos grows or that it feeds itself or that it has desires. No, and so yes, I mean, given Aristotle's definition of soul, it's hard to see how, from an Aristotelian point of view, that the cosmos could have a soul. That I agree with you, Kara. That was part of your point. No?
Thank you very much. This would be for a very long debate, so thank you.
Okay, let me thank all of you, and especially Ricardo Salles, Brooke, Holmes, and the contributors who take part in this. Thank you very much. It was a very rich debate. I will let now Federico present the whole series.
Yes, just very quickly. Of course, I join Arianna in thanking Ricardo, Brooke, and all those who participated in it. And with the Heusteron Proteron, I would like to thank Arianna for sharing this session. Say that Arianna is a PhD student in Turin and in Geneva, and she deals with the Middle Platonist use of Stoic cosmology. But above all, I'm now sharing my screen. You should be able to see the program of the shelves of this year. So I would just like to introduce the event of next week. We'll have David Ibri presenting Alexander Long's Immortality in Ancient Philosophy on April 27th. Of course, if you want to attend this event, just write an email and we'll circulate the link. So thank you so much again, and see you hopefully very, very soon. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Brooke.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.